Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that is both simple and endlessly deep. A question that has followed humanity through science, philosophy, and quiet moments of reflection alike. Is consciousness the true foundation of reality? But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Tonight we won't rush toward answers. Instead, we'll move slowly, like watching ripples spread across still water. We'll begin with something so familiar that it's easy to overlook: your own experience. Because before there were stars, before there were equations, before there were even ideas about space and time, there is something quietly present, something that is here, right now, and it is aware. If you pause for just a moment and notice what is happening right now, you may begin to sense something very simple. There are sounds, perhaps distant, perhaps close. There are thoughts moving softly in the background. There may even be a feeling of the body resting, or the subtle rhythm of your breath. And all of this is appearing to you. Not in a complicated way, not as theory, but as something immediate. You are aware. It's such a familiar fact that it almost disappears into the background of everything else. Like the quiet hum of a room you've been sitting in for too long, it fades. Not because it isn't there, but because it is always there. And yet, if you gently bring your attention back to it, there is something quite unusual about this awareness. Because you can notice many things. You can notice your thoughts. You can notice your emotions. You can notice even the sensation of your body. But the one thing you cannot step outside of is the noticing itself. You can imagine leaving your room. You can imagine floating above the earth. You can even imagine drifting beyond the stars. But no matter how far your imagination travels, it always happens within awareness. There is no place you can go where experience does not follow, even in dreams, when the world changes completely. Even in deep imagination, where time and space seem to bend, there is still something present, quietly witnessing it all. And this raises a very gentle question. What is more fundamental? The things you experience, or the fact that you are experiencing at all? At first, it might seem obvious. Of course the world comes first, we might think. Of course the brain, the body, the universe, all of that must exist before experience can happen. And yet, if we look closely, we notice something subtle. Everything you know about the world, every idea about space, every concept about time, appears within experience. Even the idea of the brain, even the image of the universe, is something you are aware of. It is like looking at a painting. You might study the shapes, the colours, the patterns, but all of it appears on a canvas, and that canvas is never directly seen. It is simply what allows everything else to appear. Awareness is a little like that. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not demand attention. It simply allows everything to be known. And because of that, it often goes unnoticed. But here is where things become quietly mysterious. Because in science, we're used to explaining things by breaking them down. We take something complex and look for smaller parts. We look for building blocks. We look for causes. And this has worked beautifully for many things. We can explain how stars form. We can describe how atoms combine. We can even map patterns of activity in the brain. But when it comes to experience itself, something feels slightly out of reach. We can describe the electrical activity of neurons. We can measure signals traveling through networks. But there is a quiet gap between those signals and the feeling of being aware, between the movement of electricity and the warmth of a memory, the softness of a thought, or the simple sense of being here. It's a bit like describing music by analysing the vibration of air. Yes, the vibration is real. Yes, it can be measured precisely. But the music, the experience of it, feels like something more. And so, instead of rushing forward, we slow down. We stay with what is directly present. Right now, there is awareness. Not as an abstract idea, not as a theory, but as something quietly undeniable. You might question many things. You might doubt what you see. You might even question the nature of reality itself. But the fact that something is being experienced is the one thing that remains. And perhaps, just for a moment, we can allow that to be enough, not as a conclusion, but as a starting point, a very gentle beginning. Because as we continue this journey, we may begin to explore an unusual possibility, that instead of awareness appearing inside the universe, in some subtle and unexpected way, might be appearing inside awareness. If you stay with that quiet sense of awareness for a little longer, something interesting begins to take shape, not as a sudden realization, but more like a soft question, slowly rising to the surface. Because once you notice that experience is always present, it becomes natural to wonder where it comes from. And this is where science, for all its remarkable achievements, begins to move a little more carefully. Because science is very good at explaining how things behave. It can describe how light travels, how planets move, how cells divide. And when it comes to the brain, it can go even further. It can measure tiny signals moving through networks of neurons. It can observe patterns lighting up in different regions. It can even predict to some extent what you might be seeing or hearing based on those patterns. From the outside, it looks incredibly precise, almost like watching a complex city at night, lights turning on and off, signals moving through invisible pathways, everything coordinated in a delicate dance. And yet, there is something about this picture that feels incomplete, because no matter how detailed the map becomes, it never quite explains one simple thing: what it feels like to be the city itself. You can imagine looking at a brain scan, bright areas glowing, connections forming and dissolving, and someone might say, this pattern corresponds to the experience of seeing a sunset. But the question quietly remains, where is the colour of the sunset? Where is the warmth of it? The quiet sense of beauty? The feeling that cannot quite be put into words? You can point to activity. You can describe processes. But the experience itself seems to exist on a different level, a softer level, almost like something that cannot be captured from the outside. And this gentle gap between physical description and lived experience has puzzled scientists and philosophers for a long time. Sometimes it is described as the difference between knowing everything about how something works and still not knowing what it feels like. For example, imagine someone who studied sound their entire life. They know how vibrations move through the air. They understand how the ear converts those vibrations into signals. They can explain every step in perfect detail. But imagine they have never actually heard music. Then one day, they listen for the first time. There would be something entirely new in that moment. Not new information, but a new kind of knowing. A knowing that is felt, not calculated. And this is the quiet challenge. Because when we look at the brain, we are looking at processes, but when we look at experience, we are looking at something that feels immediate, personal, and somehow irreducible. It does not seem to break down into smaller parts in the same way. You cannot divide the feeling of warmth into smaller pieces and still have the same feeling. You cannot take apart the experience of a memory and find its meaning sitting neatly inside one corner. Instead, it appears all at once, like a whole, not like a collection of pieces. And so, a very gentle tension begins to form. On one side, there is the world of measurable processes. On the other, the world of lived experience. Both are real. Both are undeniable. But how do they relate? How does one become the other? How does a pattern of signals become the feeling of being alive? And here, science becomes honest in a quiet way. Because while there are many theories, there is no final answer. Some ideas suggest that when information is shared widely across the brain, it becomes conscious, almost like a message being broadcast through a network. Other ideas suggest that consciousness arises when a system becomes deeply integrated, when all its parts work together as a unified whole. These are thoughtful, carefully developed approaches, and they bring us closer to understanding how experience might be connected to physical processes. But even then, there is still that soft, lingering question. Why does any of this feel like something at all? Why isn't it just activity without experience? And perhaps more quietly, why is there something it is like to be you? Right now, this is not a problem in the usual sense. It is not something broken that needs fixing. It is more like a doorway, a place where our understanding begins to open outward into something deeper. Because if experience cannot be fully explained by physical processes alone, then maybe, just maybe, it is not something that appears at the end of the story, but something that has been there from the very beginning. Not as an addition, but as a foundation, a quiet presence that allows everything else to be known. And as this idea begins to gently settle, not as a conclusion but as a possibility, our perspective shifts just a little. Instead of asking how awareness is produced, we begin to wonder, what kind of universe would allow awareness to exist at all? And whether the answer might not lie in adding more pieces, but in looking at the whole in a different way. As that quiet question lingers, why experience feels like something at all, we may begin to notice something even more subtle, because awareness is not only present, it is also rich. It has texture, it has tone, it has a kind of depth that cannot be reduced to numbers or signals. If you think about a simple moment, perhaps the taste of something warm, or the sound of rain against a window, or the feeling of remembering a place you haven't visited in a long time. There is something unmistakable about these experiences. They are not just events, they are felt, and that feeling is not something you can fully describe from the outside. You can explain the chemistry of taste, the vibration of sound, the patterns of memory in the brain, but the experience itself remains something only you can know directly. It is like trying to describe the colour blue to someone who has never seen it. You can compare it, you can gesture toward it, but at some point words fall gently away, because the knowing of it is not in the description, it is in the experience itself. And this kind of knowing has a very different quality. It is not built step by step, it is not calculated, it simply appears all at once. Like recognizing a familiar face in a crowd, you don't analyze each feature separately, you just know. And this invites a very quiet shift in perspective, because perhaps not all knowing is the same. There's the kind of knowing that comes from measurement, from analysis, from careful observation of patterns, and then there is another kind, a more immediate knowing, the kind that is present in every moment of experience, a knowing that does not need translation. You do not need to explain to yourself what warmth feels like. You already know. And this raises a gentle possibility. What if experience is not something that needs to be explained away, but something that reveals a deeper layer of reality, not as an illusion, but as a clue? Because if experience carries this direct, undeniable quality, then perhaps it is pointing towards something fundamental, something that cannot be reduced further. In many ways, science has often tried to understand the world by starting with smaller and smaller pieces, atoms, then smaller than atoms, then fields and patterns beneath those, each step revealing more detail, more structure. And yet experience does not seem to behave in that way. It does not feel like a collection of tiny parts. It feels whole, unified, even when it contains many elements at once. You can hear a sound, feel your breath, and think a thought, all at the same time. And yet it does not feel like three separate worlds. It feels like one seamless field of experience, everything appearing together in a single, continuous flow. And this sense of unity is difficult to ignore, because it suggests that experience is not assembled piece by piece, but arises as a whole. And if that is true, then perhaps the deeper structure of reality might also be more unified than we usually imagine, not divided into separate things, but connected in a way that is not immediately visible. This idea begins to echo something we touched on earlier, that the gap between physical processes and experience might not simply be a missing explanation, but a sign that we are looking from the wrong direction. Instead of asking how parts come together to create experience, we might begin to ask whether experience itself is already whole, and whether what we call parts are something that appear within it. This is not a conclusion, just a soft reorientation, a different way of holding the question. And as we sit with this, another quiet observation emerges, because experience is not only something that is felt, it is also something that changes. Thoughts come and go, sensations rise and fall, memories appear, then fade again, and yet through all of this change, there is a sense of continuity, a gentle thread that remains, the sense that you are still here, experiencing, even as the contents of experience shift and move like waves. And this continuity is curious, because it suggests that awareness is not identical to what appears within it. Thoughts change, but awareness remains. Feelings change, but awareness remains. Even the sense of time passing is something that is noticed, which raises a subtle but profound question. If awareness can observe time, then is it entirely inside time, or is it, in some quiet way, standing just slightly outside of it, not separate, but not fully contained either, like a still point, around which everything else seems to move? And as this idea begins to gently unfold, we may start to sense that awareness is not just another thing within the universe, like a star or a particle or a field, but something that relates to all things, without being exactly the same as any one of them. And if that is the case, then perhaps understanding reality requires more than looking outward, more than measuring and describing. Perhaps it also requires looking inward, not in a dramatic or intense way, but in the same gentle way we've been doing here, simply noticing what is already present. Because in that quiet noticing, we may begin to find that awareness is not something distant or abstract, but something intimately familiar, something that has been here all along, waiting patiently to be recognized. As this quiet sense of awareness continues to unfold, a new kind of curiosity begins to emerge. Not about the mind this time, but about the world itself. Because if experience feels unified, if everything you perceive appears together in a single, seamless field, then it becomes natural to wonder whether the world beyond us might also be more connected than it first appears. At first glance, the world seems clearly divided. Objects are separate, people are separate, distances stretch between things. A tree stands over there, a mountain far away, a star even farther still. Everything appears arranged in space, spread out, distinct. And for a long time, this view worked very well. Science described the universe as a collection of separate pieces, interacting through forces, touching, pushing, pulling, always local, meaning something here could only affect something nearby, like ripples in water, spreading outward step by step. But as scientists began to look more closely, at smaller and smaller scales, something unexpected appeared, a kind of connection that did not follow these familiar rules. Imagine for a moment two tiny systems, created together, linked in some deep and subtle way. Now imagine they move far apart, not just across a room, but across vast distances. And yet, when something changes in one, the other reflects that change, not after a delay, but immediately, as if distance does not quite apply. This is not something imagined. It is something that has been carefully tested, observed again and again, until scientists had to accept that it is simply part of how nature behaves. And while the details can become quite technical, the essence of it is surprisingly simple. There are connections in the universe that do not seem to depend on space, connections that remain, even when things are far apart. At first, this feels almost impossible, because we are used to thinking of space as the stage on which everything happens, a kind of invisible grid, where every object has a position, and every interaction follows a path. But this strange connection suggests something different. It suggests that what we call distance may not be as fundamental as we thought, that perhaps what appears as separation is only part of the picture. To make this a little more intuitive, imagine a story being written across 2 pages. You might look at the pages and see 2 separate surfaces, but the story itself is not divided. It flows continuously, even though it appears in different places. In a similar way, these connected systems may appear separate in space, but at a deeper level, they are part of a single unfolding process, not 2 things, but one relationship, expressing itself in 2 places. And this idea begins to gently shift our perspective. Because if connection does not depend entirely on distance, then perhaps space is not the most fundamental layer of reality. Perhaps it is something that emerges from deeper patterns of connection, like the image on a screen, emerging from countless tiny signals beneath it. The image looks continuous, structured, real, but underneath, there is a hidden layer of relationships, giving rise to what we see. And this opens a very quiet possibility that space itself might be something like that image, a surface formed from deeper connections, rather than the foundation those connections depend on. At this point, there is no need to rush toward conclusions. It is enough to sit with the feeling of it. That the universe may not be built from isolated pieces, but from relationships, from connections that remain, even when things appear far apart. And as this idea settles, it begins to echo something we noticed earlier, the unity of experience, the way everything appears together, within awareness, not as separate fragments, but as a whole. Perhaps this is only a coincidence, or perhaps it is a gentle hint that the way things feel from the inside and the way the universe behaves at its deepest levels are not entirely unrelated, and if that is so, then the boundary between inner and outer, between experience and world, may be softer than we imagine, more like a gradient than a sharp line. And from here, another question begins to quietly take shape. If space might not be fundamental, if connection comes first, then what is space made of? What gives rise to the sense of distance, of here and there, of near and far? And as we continue, we may begin to explore the possibility that space is not something we move through, but something that forms out of deeper patterns of relation. As this sense of deep connection begins to feel more natural, not as something sudden, but as a gentle shift in how we see, our attention naturally begins to move towards something we usually take for granted, space itself. Because if connection can exist without depending on distance, then it becomes natural to ask, what exactly is distance made of? We are so familiar with space that it rarely feels like a question. It seems obvious. There is here, and there is there, and between them a stretch of space. We move through it, we measure it, we build our entire understanding of the world around it, and yet, when we begin to look a little more closely, space starts to feel less like a solid foundation and more like something that quietly appears. To sense this, you might try a very simple reflection. Imagine closing your eyes for a moment and picturing a place you know well, perhaps a room, a street, or a landscape you have visited before. Even with your eyes closed, there is still a sense of space, a sense of distance between objects, a sense of layout, of position, and yet all of it is appearing within your awareness, not outside, but within. The room you imagine is not physically there, but the experience of space is still present. This doesn't mean physical space is an illusion, but it gently shows us something important, that the feeling of space, the sense of distance, is something that can arise within experience itself. And this opens a subtle possibility that what we call space might not be a fixed container, but something that depends on relationships, on how things are connected, rather than where they're located. To make this more intuitive, imagine a network of points connected by lines. Each point represents something, and each line represents a relationship between them. If the connections change, the shape of the network changes, distances stretch or shrink, not because space itself is moving, but because the relationships are shifting. Now imagine that what we perceive as space is simply how this network of relationships appears to us, not the underlying structure, but the image formed from it, like the surface of a woven fabric where threads cross and intertwine beneath. And what we see is the pattern that emerges on top. In this way, space might be less like a container and more like a pattern created by deeper connections that we do not directly see. This idea may feel unfamiliar at first, but it carries a certain quiet elegance, because it allows us to think of the universe not as a collection of things placed inside space, but as a web of relationships from which space itself arises. And this brings us back gently to something we felt earlier, the unity of experience, the sense that everything we perceive appears together, not as isolated fragments, but as part of a continuous whole. Perhaps, in some subtle way, the structure of reality reflects that same principle. Not divided first, but connected first, with division appearing later as a kind of surface effect. And as we stay with this idea, another gentle question begins to form. If space can emerge from relationships, then what about time? Because just like space, time feels fundamental. It seems to flow from past to present to future. Moments passing, one after another, carrying everything forward. But if space can arise from deeper patterns, then perhaps time too might not be as fixed as it appears. Before we move there is one more quiet step to take, because if space is not fundamental, if it emerges from something deeper, then what is that deeper layer made of? What are these relationships that give rise to the structure we experience? In modern physics, there is a growing sense that at the deepest level, what we call things may not be things at all, but patterns of connection, patterns of interaction, patterns that carry information, not in the sense of cold data, but in the sense of structure, arrangement, possibility. And this word, possibility, begins to open another door, because if reality at its deepest level is not made of solid objects, but of possibilities, then what we experience as the world may be something like a selection, a gentle choosing from many potential ways things could be. Not random, but not fully predetermined either. Like a melody that could unfold in different ways, yet takes one path, note by note. And this idea will become important as we continue, because it leads us toward a deeper question, not just about what exists, but about how possibilities become actual experience, how something that could be becomes something that is. And in that quiet transition, from possibility to reality, we may begin to glimpse something even more subtle, something that connects awareness, choice, and the unfolding of the universe itself. As our sense of space begins to gently loosen, not fading away but softening at the edges, our attention begins to drift towards something even more subtle. Because if space is not the most fundamental layer, then what exactly is underneath it? What gives rise to the patterns we experience as distance, shape, and form? At first, it might seem natural to imagine smaller and smaller pieces, tiny building blocks, invisible particles, little units that make up everything we see. This has been a very powerful way of understanding the world, breaking things down, looking closer, finding structure within structure. But as science has continued this journey, looking deeper and deeper, something unexpected has begun to happen. The idea of solid things starts to fade. Instead of firm, well-defined objects, we begin to find something more fluid, more like patterns that change, patterns that interact, patterns that only become clear when we observe them in certain ways. It is a bit like watching the surface of the ocean. From a distance, you might point to a wave and say, "There, that is something." But if you look more closely, the wave is not a separate object. It is a movement, a pattern of motion, formed by the interaction of water, energy, and conditions beneath the surface. The wave appears, it travels, it fades, but at no point is it a solid, independent thing. It is always part of a larger process, and in a quiet way. Modern physics suggests that what we call particles may be something like that, not tiny solid objects, but stable patterns emerging from deeper activity, patterns that behave consistently, so consistently in fact that we treat them as things, but underneath they remain part of a continuous dynamic system, a kind of ever-changing field of possibility. And this word, possibility, becomes more important the deeper we go, because at this level, reality does not seem to consist only of what is happening, but also of what could happen, not in a vague or imaginary sense, but in a very real, structured way. You might think of it like a quiet landscape of potential, where many outcomes are possible, but only one is realized in each moment, like a path through a forest where many trails exist. But you take one step, and that step defines the path you're on. Before the step, there are possibilities. After the step, there is a chosen direction. And something similar seems to occur at the deepest levels of nature. There are many possible ways a system could behave, but when an event happens, one of those possibilities becomes real. The others remain unrealized, not gone, but not expressed. And this transition from possibility to actuality is one of the most subtle and fascinating aspects of reality, because while science can describe the range of possibilities, it becomes much less clear why one outcome happens instead of another. It is as if reality is constantly poised on the edge of many potential futures, and then, gently, one unfolds, not with a dramatic jump, but with a quiet settling, like a note being chosen in a melody. And this raises a question that is both simple and profound. What guides this unfolding? Is it purely random? Is it fully determined? Or is there something else? Something more subtle, involved in how possibilities become real? For a long time, many scientists assumed that randomness was the answer, that at the deepest level, events simply occur without reason, following probabilities, but without intention. And while this idea works mathematically, it leaves behind a certain feeling of incompleteness, because randomness by itself does not explain why the world appears so structured, so coherent, so capable of giving rise to life and awareness. And so, quietly, some thinkers have begun to explore another possibility, that the unfolding of reality may not be entirely random, but also not strictly predetermined, that it may involve something like selection, a gentle choosing among possibilities, not necessarily in a conscious human sense, but as a fundamental aspect of how reality expresses itself. And this idea begins to form a bridge between the world of physical patterns and the world of experience. Because in experience, we're familiar with something like this. We're familiar with choice, with deciding between possibilities, with bringing one path into reality while leaving others behind. And as we notice this, a quiet connection begins to appear between the structure of the world and the structure of our own awareness. Both seem to involve possibilities and the unfolding of one path among many. Both seem to move, not as fixed sequences, but as dynamic processes, shaping themselves moment by moment, and this gentle similarity invites a deeper reflection. Because perhaps what we are seeing in the world is not entirely separate from what we experience within. Perhaps the patterns we observe in nature and the patterns we feel in awareness are expressions of something shared, something that appears differently depending on how we look. And as this idea begins to settle, not as a conclusion, but as a soft opening, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a new perspective, where reality is no longer made of solid things, but of patterns, possibilities, and the quiet process by which one possibility becomes real. And from here, it becomes natural to ask, if the world is made of patterns and possibilities, then what is it that gives those patterns meaning? What transforms structure into experience? As these ideas begin to settle, not as firm conclusions, but as gentle possibilities, we may start to notice a quiet pattern in the way we have been thinking. Again and again, we have been trying to understand the world by beginning with smaller pieces. We look for the tiniest parts, the most basic building blocks, the simplest elements from which everything else can be constructed. It feels natural to do this. If you want to understand a machine, you take it apart. If you want to understand a structure, you break it down into components, and for many things. This approach works beautifully. But as we've seen, when we follow this path deeper into reality, something curious begins to happen. The parts we're looking for become less and less solid. They turn into patterns, relationships, possibilities, and at a certain point, it becomes difficult to say where one part ends and another begins, like colours blending into each other. There is no sharp boundary, only a gradual transition. And this invites a very quiet reconsideration, because if the parts are not clearly defined, if everything seems to be interconnected at a deeper level, then perhaps starting from separate pieces is not the only way to understand the whole. Perhaps we've been looking from the wrong direction. Instead of asking, how do parts come together to form the whole? We might gently ask, what if the whole is already there, and what we call parts are simply ways of looking at it? This is not a new idea. In many areas of science, there has been a gradual movement toward thinking in terms of systems, networks, wholes that cannot be fully understood by isolating their components. For example, if you look at a living body, you can study its cells, you can examine its organs, you can describe each part in detail, but the body as a whole has properties that none of the individual parts possess on their own. A single cell does not breathe. A single cell does not think. And yet, when many cells interact in just the right way, something new appears, a living organism, a unified being. And even more interestingly, each cell still contains the complete blueprint of the whole organism, not just a fragment, but the entire pattern held within it. So in a sense, each part reflects the whole, even while appearing separate, and this idea begins to resonate with what we've been exploring. That reality may not be built from isolated pieces, but from a deeper unity, from which the appearance of parts emerges. If we stay with this for a moment, it begins to feel less like a dramatic claim, and more like a gentle shift in perspective. Instead of imagining the universe as a collection of things, we begin to imagine it as a single interconnected process, a whole that expresses itself in many forms, like a wave that takes on different shapes, yet remains the same water throughout. And this brings us to a subtle but important question. If the whole comes first, then what is the nature of that whole? Is it simply a vast physical system, a complex network of interactions, or could it be something more, something that includes not only structure, but also experience? At this point, it is important to move gently. There is no need to jump to strong conclusions. Instead, we can simply explore a possibility. What if the same quality we observe in our own awareness, the ability to experience, the ability to know, is not something that appears only at the end of a long chain of complexity, but something that is present in some form at the deepest level of reality, not necessarily in the same way we experience it, not with thoughts or memories or identity, but as a more fundamental capacity, a capacity for being aware. If this were the case, then the universe would not be something entirely separate from experience, but something that already contains it in its most basic nature. And what we call individual minds would not be isolated creations, but expressions, localized ways in which that deeper awareness becomes visible. This may sound unfamiliar at first, but notice how gently it follows from what we have already seen. We have seen that parts are not as separate as they appear. We have seen that relationships may be more fundamental than objects. We have seen that experience cannot be fully reduced to physical description. So perhaps, instead of placing awareness at the very end of the story, we can consider placing it closer to the beginning, not as something added later, but as something that is already present, quietly, at the foundation. And from this perspective, the universe begins to feel a little different, not like a cold collection of things, but like a unified process, unfolding, expressing itself in many forms. And as this idea gently settles into place, it naturally opens the door to a deeper question. If reality is, in some sense, a whole, and if awareness may be part of its fundamental nature, then could it be that the universe, in its own way, is aware of itself, not as a human mind is aware, but as something more subtle, more diffuse, more fundamental? And if that were true, then everything we experience now would not simply exist, but would be part of a much larger process, a process of the whole, coming to know itself. As this possibility begins to take shape, not as something to believe, but something to gently explore, we may find ourselves standing at the edge of a new kind of question. Because if reality is not built from isolated pieces, if it is instead a unified whole, and if awareness is not something that appears only at the surface, then what is this whole at its deepest level? There is a simple way to approach this, not through definitions, but through imagination. Imagine, for a moment, a reality that is not made of separate things, but is entirely one continuous existence, not divided into parts, not separated by boundaries, just one unbroken whole. Now within this whole, something begins to happen, not a movement in space, not a change in position, but a kind of subtle differentiation, a way of looking at itself from different perspectives, like a mirror reflecting itself, not once, but endlessly, each reflection slightly different, each one revealing something new. In this gentle image, the whole is not static, it is dynamic. It is not simply existing, it is unfolding, and as it unfolds, it is, in a sense, knowing itself, not in words, not in thoughts, but in the most direct way possible, through experience. This idea may feel abstract at first, but there is something quietly familiar about it, because in your own experience, you also come to know yourself, not by analysing yourself from the outside, but by living, by feeling, by encountering different moments and recognising yourself within them, in a very soft way. The same pattern could be imagined at a much larger scale, a scale where the universe itself is the one doing the knowing, and everything that exists is part of that process. At this point, it can be helpful to give this idea a simple name, not because names define it, but because they allow us to refer to it gently. We might call it the One, not as a rigid concept, but as a way of pointing toward the totality of everything that exists, all matter, all energy, all patterns, all possibilities, and perhaps all experience. The One is not somewhere else. It is not beyond the universe. It is the universe, seen as a whole. And if we imagine that this whole has the capacity, in some deep and subtle way, to experience, then a new picture begins to emerge, not of a universe made of separate objects, but of a single, continuous reality, expressing itself through many forms, each form a kind of perspective, a way of the whole encountering itself. You might think of it like light passing through a prism. The light itself is one, but it appears as many colours, each colour revealing a different aspect of the same underlying source. In a similar way, each conscious experience could be seen as a different colour, a different expression of a deeper unity. This does not mean that everything is identical, It does not remove the uniqueness of each perspective. Instead, it suggests that individuality and unity are not opposites, but two aspects of the same reality, the whole, and the ways in which the whole appears. And as we sit with this idea, something else begins to gently shift, because if each perspective is part of the whole, then the boundaries between self and world begin to soften, not disappearing, but becoming less absolute. The sense of being a separate observer, looking out at an external universe, may be just one way of experiencing, among many, a particular point of view within a much larger field. And this field, if we follow this idea, is not passive, it is active, creative, continuously unfolding, not assembling itself from parts, but expressing itself in different forms, moment by moment. And in that expression, there is a quiet continuity, because each new moment, each new experience, adds something to the unfolding of the whole, not as an external addition, but as deepening of what is already there, like a story being told, where each new sentence does not replace the previous ones, but builds upon them, enriches them, expands their meaning. In this way, reality may not simply exist, but evolve, not only in structure, but in understanding, not in a human sense of thought, but in a more fundamental sense of knowing. And if this is so, then the universe is not just a stage where things happen, it is part of the happening itself, a living process in which existence and knowing are deeply intertwined. And as this idea gently settles, we arrive at a question that feels both simple and quietly profound. If the universe is in some way a whole that knows itself, then what does it mean to exist within it? What does it mean to be one of the perspectives through which that knowing unfolds? And perhaps more gently, what if knowing and existing are not two separate things, but two sides of the same quiet process? As this image of a unified whole slowly settles into place, not as something rigid, but as a quiet possibility we are simply exploring, our attention begins to turn towards something even more subtle, something that sits right at the edge of everything we have been sensing so far. Because if reality is not just a collection of things, if it is instead a continuous unfolding, and if awareness is somehow woven into its deepest structure, then there is a question that naturally arises, almost without effort. What is the relationship between knowing something and that thing existing at all? At first, this might seem like an unusual question. We are used to thinking that things exist first, and then we come to know them. A tree grows in a forest, whether we see it or not. A star shines far away, long before anyone notices it. Existence, it seems, comes first, and knowing comes later. But if we stay with our experience for just a moment, something slightly different begins to reveal itself. Everything you know, everything you have ever known, appears to you through experience. The memory of a place, the image of a person, the idea of a distant galaxy, all of it is known within awareness. Even the thought of something existing out there is itself, something you are aware of. So from this perspective, knowing is not something that happens after existence. It is the only way existence ever appears to you at all. This is not meant to deny the world, not at all. It is simply a gentle observation that for anything to be part of your reality, it must, in some sense, be known. And here, a very subtle shift begins to take place, because instead of imagining knowing as a passive act, like looking at something that is already fully formed, we begin to wonder whether knowing might be more active than it seems, not in a dramatic or forceful way, but in a quiet, foundational sense. To explore this, imagine entering a completely dark room. At first, there is nothing visible, no shapes, no objects, no sense of space. The room may be there, but for you, it is not yet part of your experience. Then very gently, a light is turned on, and in that moment, something changes. The shapes of objects appear, distances become clear. The room, which was previously hidden, now becomes part of your reality. It would be easy to say that the light simply revealed what was already there, and in many ways, that is true. But from the perspective of experience, something deeper has happened. Before the light, the room was not part of your world. After the light, it is. The act of illumination did not create the room, but it did create your experience of it, and in a very soft way this begins to hint at something more general, that knowing is not just observing, it is also bringing something into the field of experience. It is allowing something to become real, in the only way it can be real to you. And if we extend this idea just a little further, not as a firm statement, but as a possibility, we might begin to imagine that at the deepest level of reality, knowing and existing are not two separate processes at all. They are two sides of the same gentle movement. To know something is to bring it into presence. To exist in this sense is to be present within knowing. This does not mean that reality depends on any one individual mind. Rather, it suggests that the unfolding of reality and the unfolding of knowing may be intimately connected, like two aspects of a single process, unfolding together. You might think of it like a story being told. The story does not fully exist before it is written. It emerges line by line as it is expressed, and each new sentence does not simply reveal the story, it becomes the story. In the same way, reality may not be a fixed script waiting to be discovered, but an unfolding expression, where each moment of knowing is also a moment of becoming. And this idea becomes even more interesting when we remember what we explored earlier about possibility. That at the deepest levels, reality seems to contain many potential ways things could unfold, and yet, in each moment, only one becomes actual. So there is a quiet transition from many possibilities to one realized experience, and if knowing is part of this transition, then it may not be too much to imagine that knowing plays a role, in which possibility becomes real, not as control, not as force, but as participation, a gentle involvement in the unfolding of reality itself. This does not need to be understood in a complex or technical way. It can be felt in something very simple. Each moment you experience is not just a passive reception of the world, it is also a kind of arrival, a moment coming into presence, a moment becoming real, and you are there, not outside of it, but within it, part of the unfolding, part of the knowing. And as this idea slowly settles, like light spreading across a quiet surface, it opens the door to an even deeper possibility. If knowing and existing are connected, if reality unfolds through this gentle process, then perhaps the universe itself is not just something that exists, but something that is continuously coming into being through a kind of self-knowing, not as a final conclusion, but as an ongoing process, a quiet unfolding in which each moment is both discovered and created at the same time. A quiet sense of reality unfolding through knowing begins to settle into view, not as a fixed conclusion, but as a gentle way of looking. Something else starts to come into view, almost like a pattern that was always there, waiting to be noticed. Because if each moment of experience is not just something we observe, but something that arrives, something that becomes real within awareness, then it becomes natural to ask how this unfolding is structured. How does reality present itself in a way that feels so consistent, so stable, and yet still full of possibility? One way to approach this is to think about something very familiar: language, not in a technical sense, but in the simple way we use it every day. Words appear on a page or sounds form in the air, and somehow meaning arises. A sentence can describe a place, a feeling, or an idea, and as you hear it, something forms in your mind. But if you look closely, the words themselves are just shapes or sounds, letters arranged in patterns, vibrations moving through space. On their own, they do not contain meaning. Meaning appears when they are experienced, when they are understood, when they are known. And this creates a quiet distinction. There are the symbols, and there is what those symbols point to. The word ocean is not the ocean. The word warmth is not the feeling of warmth. And yet, through the symbol, something is evoked. Something is brought into experience. Now, if we gently extend this idea, we might begin to wonder whether the physical world itself could be something similar, not in a literal sense of words and letters, but as a kind of structured system, where patterns stand for something deeper, where what we perceive is not the final layer, but an expression, a representation, a way of communicating something more fundamental. Imagine for a moment watching a film. On the screen you see people, places, movement, emotion. It feels real enough to follow, to care about, to become immersed in. But beneath the image, there is a different layer, tiny points of light, turning on and off, forming patterns so quickly and so precisely that they create the illusion of a continuous world. The story is not in the pixels themselves. It emerges through the arrangement, through the pattern. In a similar way, what we call physical reality might be understood not just as a collection of objects, but as a structured display, a way in which deeper processes appear, not unlike a language, where what we see and touch are the symbols, and something deeper is being expressed through them. This does not make the world less real. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because it suggests that reality has layers, a visible surface, and a deeper meaning that is not directly seen, but can be experienced. To sense this more clearly, you might think about a piece of music. If you were to write it down, it would appear as notes on a page, precise, structured, measurable. But the notes are not the music. The music appears when the notes are played, when they are heard, when they are felt. And each listener may experience it slightly differently, even though the structure remains the same. In this way, the notes act as symbols, and the music is the meaning that arises through them. Now, imagine that something similar is happening with reality itself. The structures we observe, the patterns we measure, are like the notes. An experience is the music, not separate from the notes, but not contained within them either, emerging through them, in a way that cannot be reduced to the structure alone. This perspective begins to gently shift how we think about the world. Instead of seeing reality as made only of physical things, we begin to see it as something that carries meaning, something that expresses, something that communicates, not necessarily in words, but in patterns, in experiences, in the way things feel when they are known. And this brings us back softly to awareness, because meaning does not exist on its own. It is always tied to experience. A symbol without anyone to understand it remains just a pattern. It is only when it is experienced that it becomes meaningful. And so, if reality truly functions like a language, then awareness is not something added afterward. It is part of the process itself. the process by which symbols become meaning, the process by which patterns become experience. And as we sit with this idea, it begins to feel less like a theory and more like a gentle shift in perception. The world around you, the objects, the sounds, the sensations, may not just be things that exist, but expressions, carrying something deeper, something that is revealed only in the act of experiencing them. And this naturally leads us toward another question, a very quiet one. If reality is a system of symbols, and experience is what gives those symbols meaning, then what is it that allows meaning to arise at all? What is this quality that turns structure into something that can be felt? As this image of reality as a kind of language begins to quietly settle, something expressed through patterns, something that becomes meaningful only when it is experienced, a new question begins to form almost naturally. If the world presents itself through symbols, and if experience is what gives those symbols meaning, then what exactly is this experience? And perhaps even more gently, can it be copied? At first, it might seem like the answer should be yes. After all, we live in a world where information can be copied almost effortlessly. A photograph can be duplicated, a message can be sent across the world in an instant, a piece of music can be recorded, stored and replayed countless times. From the outside, everything appears transferable. Anything that can be represented as data can be moved, copied, preserved. But experience feels different. You can describe a moment to someone else. You can explain what you saw, what you heard, what you felt. You can choose your words carefully. You can be precise, poetic, detailed. And yet, no matter how accurate the description is, it never becomes the experience itself. Imagine trying to describe the taste of something warm and comforting, perhaps a familiar drink you've had many times. You might say it is sweet or smooth or rich. You might compare it to other flavors, but for someone who has never tasted it, those words remain only hints. They do not carry the taste itself. The experience must be lived directly. And this difference between description and experience is easy to overlook, but it is very important because it shows that experience is not just information. It is not just patterns that can be stored and transmitted. It is something that exists only in the moment it is felt, something that cannot be separated from the act of experiencing it. To see this more clearly, imagine watching a sunset, the colours shifting slowly, the light softening across the horizon, the quiet feeling that often comes with it. You could take a photograph of that moment, and the photograph might capture the shapes, the arrangement of colours. It might even look very similar to what you saw, but the experience of being there, the feeling of the air, the subtle changes, over time, the quiet sense of presence. None of that is contained in the image. The photograph holds information, but not the experience itself. And this distinction becomes even clearer when we consider something more personal, a memory, a moment that matters deeply to you. You can recall it, you can describe it, you can even revisit parts of it in your mind, but even then, there is a difference between remembering and being there. The original experience had a richness, a depth, that cannot be fully recreated, and this suggests something very quiet but very important. That experience is not something that exists independently, waiting to be accessed or copied. It is something that happens, something that arises in the moment of knowing. It cannot be extracted, it cannot be stored, it cannot be transferred in the way information can, because it is not separate from the act of experiencing itself. And this brings us back to the idea of meaning. Earlier, we noticed that symbols carry structure. But meaning arises only when those symbols are experienced. Now we begin to see why. Because meaning is not contained within the symbols themselves. It is something that appears in the interaction between the symbol and awareness. Without awareness, there is structure, but no meaning. With awareness, that structure becomes something felt, something known. And this helps us understand why experience cannot be copied, because copying would require separating the experience from the awareness that gives it life. But they are not separate. They are two aspects of the same event, the same moment, the same unfolding. To copy the structure is not to copy the experience. It is only to recreate the pattern without the feeling. And this becomes especially interesting when we think about systems that process information. Machines can store vast amounts of data. They can recognize patterns. They can even generate responses that resemble understanding. But all of this happens at the level of symbols, patterns being transformed into other patterns. What remains unclear is whether there is anything it feels like to be that system, whether there is any experience behind the processing. And this question is not easily answered, because from the outside, we can only observe behavior, we can only see the patterns, but experience is always from the inside. It cannot be observed directly, only inferred. And so, we are left with a gentle but important realization. That experience is something fundamentally different from the structures we can measure and describe. It is not less real. If anything, it is the most immediate reality we have. But it does not behave like information. It cannot be reduced to symbols, even if symbols can point toward it. And as this idea slowly settles, it begins to deepen our understanding of everything we have explored so far. If reality presents itself through patterns, and if those patterns become meaningful only through experience, then experience is not something secondary. It is essential. It is what completes the picture. And this leads us very gently to the next step. If experience cannot be reduced to information, then what is this quality that gives rise to meaning? What is it that allows patterns to become something felt, something known, something real in the deepest sense of the word? As this distinction between information and experience begins to settle, not as a rigid separation, but as a soft understanding, our attention naturally drifts towards something even more subtle. Because if patterns alone are not enough, if structure by itself does not create meaning, then something else must be involved. Something that allows a pattern to become something felt, something that turns a sequence of signals into a moment of experience. We can begin to approach this not by defining it immediately, but by noticing it. Right now, as you listen, there is not only sound, there is the sense of understanding. Words are forming, and somehow, without effort, they carry meaning. You do not translate each sound step by step. You do not analyze each word consciously. Meaning appears almost instantly, like a shape emerging from a fog, and this immediacy is important, because it shows that meaning is not something constructed slowly from parts. It arrives all at once, whole, just like experience itself. To sense this more clearly, imagine reading a sentence in a language you understand. The moment your eyes move across the words, the meaning is simply there. But if you were to look at the same sentence in a language you do not know, the shapes remain, the structure remains, but the meaning is absent. Nothing has changed in the symbols themselves, only in the way they are experienced, and this reveals something quietly profound. Meaning is not in the symbols, it is not hidden inside them, waiting to be extracted. It appears in the act of experiencing them. This may seem like a small observation, but it has far-reaching implications, because it suggests that reality, if it is indeed structured like a system of symbols, does not contain meaning on its own. Meaning arises only when those patterns are experienced, when they are known. And this brings us closer to understanding the nature of experience itself. Because experience is not just something that happens, it is something that carries meaning. A feeling is not just a signal, it is meaningful. A memory is not just stored information, it has significance. Even something as simple as warmth is not just a measurable condition, it is something that feels a certain way. And this feeling of something is what gives experience its richness. It is what makes it more than data. Sometimes this quality is described in more technical language, but we can keep it simple here. It is simply what it feels like. The softness of a quiet moment, the clarity of a thought, the depth of an emotion. These are not things we measure from the outside. They are things we live from the inside. And because of this, they cannot be separated from awareness. They do not exist independently. They arise within the field of experiencing. And this leads to a very gentle realization that meaning is not something added to reality after it exists. It is part of how reality appears, when it is experienced. Without experience, there may still be structure, but there is no meaning. With experience, structure becomes something alive, something felt, something understood. And so, meaning can be seen as a bridge between pattern and experience, between what is observed and what is lived. And this bridge does not exist on its own. It exists only in the act of experiencing. Now, if we return to the idea that reality may be a kind of symbolic system, then this becomes even more interesting, because it suggests that the universe is not only structured, but also capable of being meaningful, not in an abstract way, but in a direct lived sense. And this raises a subtle but important question. If meaning only appears in experience, then what is the role of awareness in the structure of reality itself? Is awareness simply something that observes meaning, or is it something that participates in bringing meaning into being? To explore this gently, consider a piece of music once more. The notes are written, the structure is fixed, but the music only truly exists when it is heard. And each time it is heard, it is slightly different. Not because the notes change, but because the experience changes, the listener changes, the moment changes. And so, the meaning is never exactly the same. It is always alive, always unfolding, and perhaps, in a similar way, reality itself is not a static structure, but something that becomes meaningful again and again, through experience, through awareness, through the act of knowing. And as this idea gently settles, we begin to see that awareness is not just a passive observer, it is part of the process, through which reality becomes something that can be felt, something that can be known, not separate from the world, but intimately connected to how the world appears. And this brings us to a deeper level of understanding, that the world we experience is not only shaped by patterns and relationships, but also by the presence of awareness itself, the presence that allows meaning to arise, the presence that turns structure into experience. And as we rest with this, another quiet step begins to unfold. If awareness plays this role, if it is part of how meaning appears, then perhaps it is not something limited to individual minds alone. Perhaps it is something more fundamental, something that exists at the very root of reality. And from here, we begin to move toward a new way of understanding the layers of existence, not as separate domains, but as different expressions of the same underlying process. as these ideas about meaning, awareness, and the unfolding of reality begin to settle, not as rigid definitions, but as a soft landscape we are slowly becoming familiar with. It can help to pause and look at something much closer to home, your own experience. Because everything we have been exploring, patterns, meaning, awareness, possibility, all of it is not happening somewhere far away. It is happening here, in the quiet immediacy of being alive. And when we look gently at this experience, something interesting begins to appear. It does not feel like a single, simple layer. Instead, it feels more like a blend, a soft mixture of different qualities, all present at once. There is the sense of the body, the weight of it, the position, the contact with the surface beneath you, the subtle rhythm of breath moving in and out. This layer feels grounded, stable, almost steady, like something that holds its shape over time. At the same time, there is the activity of the mind. Thoughts forming and dissolving, images appearing, memories drifting in and out, small predictions about what might happen next. This layer feels more fluid, more dynamic, constantly shifting. And then, there is something even quieter. Not a thought, not a sensation, but the simple fact that all of this is being experienced, a kind of open presence that does not push or pull, but allows everything else to appear. At first, it might seem natural to think of these as separate layers, body, mind, and something beyond. But if we look more closely, they do not feel separate at all. They overlap. They blend. They move through each other in a way that is difficult to divide cleanly. A helpful way to sense this is through something very simple. Colour. Imagine 3 colours. Red, green and blue. On their own, each colour is distinct. But when they are combined, they create new colours, gradients, shades, soft transitions where one becomes another. And in many cases it becomes impossible to point to a precise boundary and say, this is where one colour ends and another begins. They exist together, interwoven. Now, imagine your experience in a similar way. The body is like one colour, stable, structured, grounding. The mind is like another, fluid, changing, exploring possibilities. And this quiet presence, the simple sense of awareness, is like a third, not separate, but always there, blending with the others. What we call being alive is not any one of these alone. It is the combination, the way they overlap, the way they create a continuous field of experience. And just like with colour, trying to isolate them completely may not capture what is actually happening, because in lived experience they are always already together. You do not first have a body, and then add a mind, and then add awareness. All of it appears at once, as a single, unified moment. And this perspective can be surprisingly helpful, because it allows us to move away from thinking in terms of strict categories, and towards something more fluid. Instead of asking, where does the body end and the mind begin? We begin to notice how they interact, how a thought can change the feeling of the body, how a sensation can influence the direction of thought, how both are held within a larger field of awareness. It is less like a stack of layers, and more like a living blend, a spectrum. And this idea of a spectrum becomes even more interesting when we connect it to what we explored earlier. That reality itself may be made of patterns, possibilities, and the process by which those possibilities become real. In this light, the body can be seen as the more stable aspect of this process. Patterns that have settled into consistent forms, reliable, predictable, holding their structure over time. The mind, on the other hand, can be seen as the more flexible aspect, a space where possibilities are explored, where different paths are imagined, where the future is gently rehearsed before it arrives, and awareness is what allows both to be experienced, what allows stability and change to appear together as a single flow. This does not require us to define anything precisely. It is not a system to memorize. It is simply a way of noticing, a way of seeing the richness of experience without forcing it into rigid boundaries. And as we become more comfortable with this idea, another quiet shift begins to occur. Because if our own experience is not divided into separate compartments, but is instead a continuous spectrum, then perhaps reality itself is structured in a similar way, not as separate domains, but as different expressions of the same underlying process, different aspects, different qualities, all blending together. And this opens the door to a deeper understanding of something we touched on earlier, that what we call matter, what we call mind, and what we call awareness may not be entirely different kinds of things, but different ways in which the same reality appears. Just as colours are different expressions of light, these aspects may be different expressions of a deeper unity. And as this idea gently settles, it prepares us for the next step in our journey. Because if the body is the more stable expression, if the mind is the more fluid, then what we experience as the physical world may carry within it something like a memory, a record of patterns that have settled and continue to hold their form. Experience begins to feel less like separate layers and more like a continuous spectrum, not as separate layers, but as qualities blending into one another. Our attention can gently settle on one part of that spectrum that feels especially familiar: the body. Because among all the changing aspects of experience, thoughts shifting, feelings rising and fading, the body often appears as something steady. It has weight, it has shape, it has a kind of persistence, a continuity that remains even as everything else moves. If you rest your attention there for a moment, you can feel this stability, the way your body holds its form, the way it returns to a kind of balance, the way it carries a quiet sense of being here. And this stability is not accidental. It reflects something deeper about the nature of what we call matter. Earlier, we began to see that at a fundamental level, reality may not be made of solid objects, but of patterns. Patterns that form, patterns that change, patterns that interact. And some of these patterns are fleeting. A thought appears, then disappears. A sound arises, then fades away. But other patterns remain. They persist. Over time, they repeat in consistent ways, so consistently in fact that they begin to feel like things, like objects, like something solid. But underneath, they are still patterns, patterns that have settled into stability. To make this more intuitive, imagine a melody that you hear again and again. The notes may unfold over time, but the pattern remains recognizable. Each time you hear it, you know it is the same melody, even though it is being played in the present moment. In a similar way, the body can be seen as a pattern that repeats itself continuously, a pattern that maintains its structure, moment after moment, so that it appears stable. And this brings us to a quiet but powerful insight, that what we call the body is not just matter in the traditional sense, but a kind of memory, not a memory like a thought or an image, but a memory in the form of structure, a memory of how things are arranged, a memory that is constantly being maintained so that the pattern continues to exist. Every cell in the body, every process, every interaction works together to preserve this pattern, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the body remains recognizable over time. And this kind of memory is not limited to the body. It appears throughout the physical world. A stone holds its shape. A tree grows in a particular form. a planet follows a stable path through space. All of these can be seen as patterns that persist, patterns that carry a kind of continuity, and this continuity is what gives rise to the feeling of a stable world, a world that does not change too quickly, a world that can be relied upon. But if we look closely, even this stability is dynamic. The body is constantly changing, cells renewing, energy flowing, processes unfolding in delicate balance. And yet, through all of this change, the overall pattern remains, like a flame that keeps its shape, even as the fire is always moving. And this reveals something subtle. That stability does not require stillness. It can arise from continuous activity, as long as the pattern is maintained. So the body, and matter more generally, can be understood as patterns that have become stable enough to persist, patterns that hold their form across time, and in doing so, carry a kind of memory forward, not a memory of events, but a memory of structure, a memory of how things are. And this perspective gently shifts how we think about the physical world. Instead of seeing matter as something fundamentally solid, we begin to see it as something more like a process that maintains its shape, a process that remembers itself by continuing to exist in a consistent way. And this idea connects quietly with what we explored earlier. That reality may be unfolding through patterns and possibilities, because if some patterns become stable, if they persist, then they begin to form the foundation upon which other experiences can arise. The body becomes the ground, the stable reference, within which thoughts can move, within which possibilities can be explored. And in this sense, the body is not separate from the deeper process of reality. It is one expression of it, one way in which patterns have settled into continuity, one way in which the unfolding of reality takes on a stable form. And as this idea gently settles, it prepares us for the next step. Because if the body represents stability, a kind of memory held in form, then the mind may represent something different, not stability, but possibility. A space where patterns have not yet settled, where different paths can be explored before one becomes real. The body begins to feel less like a fixed object, and more like a stable pattern that quietly holds its form, something that holds its form, something that carries continuity forward. Our attention naturally shifts toward another part of experience that feels very different, the mind. Because while the body feels grounded and steady, the mind feels fluid. It moves. Thoughts appear and dissolve. Images form and fade. Memories rise quietly and drift away again. There is a kind of motion here, a sense that things are not fixed, but constantly changing. And yet, within this movement, there is also something subtle happening. The mind is not just changing randomly. It is exploring. It is moving through possibilities. You might notice this in something very simple. Imagine thinking about what you'll do tomorrow. Without effort, different options begin to appear. You might go somewhere. You might stay home. You might speak to someone. Each possibility takes shape for a moment, then gives way to another. None of them have happened yet. And yet, they feel real enough to consider. They exist in a different way, not as physical events, but as potential experiences. And this is what makes the mind so unique. It is not limited to what is happening right now. It can move freely through what has been, through what could be. It can revisit the past, not perfectly, but in a way that brings fragments of it back into the present. A memory appears, and for a moment it feels almost as if you're there again, not completely, but enough to sense its presence. At the same time, the mind can move toward the future. It can imagine situations that have not yet occurred, rehearse conversations, picture outcomes, explore different paths before any step is taken, and all of this happens quietly, within awareness, without changing the physical world. The mind creates a kind of inner landscape, a space of possibilities. To understand this more intuitively, imagine standing at a crossroads. There are many paths you could take. Each path leads somewhere different. Before you choose, all of those paths exist as possibilities. They are not yet real in the sense of being walked, but they are present as options. The mind functions in a similar way. It allows multiple directions to appear, side by side, without immediately committing to one. And this ability is deeply important, because it gives rise to something we experience every day. Choice, not in a dramatic sense, but in small, continuous ways. Choosing what to say, choosing what to do, choosing where to place your attention. Each of these moments involves a subtle shift from possibility to action, and the mind plays a central role in this process. It presents possibilities, it explores them, and then, somehow, one of them becomes real. This does not always feel like a deliberate decision. Sometimes it happens almost automatically, but even then, there is a sense that different outcomes were possible, that things could have unfolded differently, and this sense of possibility is what gives the mind its openness, its flexibility, its ability to move beyond the immediate present without leaving it entirely. Because even when the mind imagines the future or revisits the past, it does so now, in this moment within awareness. And this brings us back gently to the relationship between the body and the mind. If the body represents stability, a pattern that persists, then the mind represents openness, a space where patterns are not yet fixed, where they can shift, combine, transform. Together they form a balance. The body grounds experience. The mind expands it. The body holds continuity. The mind introduces possibility, and awareness holds both, not as separate layers, but as aspects of a single unfolding. And as we sit with this, another subtle insight begins to emerge. Because the mind does not only explore possibilities, it also shapes how reality is experienced. The same situation can feel different, depending on how it is interpreted. A memory can bring comfort or discomfort, depending on how it is held in the mind. A future event can feel exciting or uncertain, depending on how it is imagined. So the mind is not just a passive space of possibilities, it is an active participant in how experience takes shape. And this leads us gently to an important realization, that reality, as it is experienced, is not only determined by stable patterns, but also by the possibilities that are explored within the mind. Both are essential, both are always present, and both are held within awareness as part of the same continuous flow. And as this idea begins to settle, it prepares us for the next step in our journey. Because if the body carries stability and the mind carries possibility, then there must be a place where these two meet, a place where what has been and what could be come together, a place where memory and imagination and choice all exist at once, and that place is the present moment. The mind reveals itself as something fluid, a space where possibilities can gently take shape, a place where different futures can be gently explored. Our attention is drawn towards something even more immediate, something so close that it is often overlooked, the present moment. Because while we often speak of the past and the future, if we look carefully, all experience happens here, not in a distant then, not in a projected later, but in this quiet, unfolding now. At first, this may seem almost too simple to notice. Of course, everything happens now. Where else could it happen? And yet, when we explore it gently, we begin to see that this present moment is far richer than it appears, because within it, there is not only what is happening right now, there is also memory and imagination and choice, all appearing together. You might notice this in something very simple. Think of a memory, perhaps something from earlier today, or a moment from long ago as you recall. It feels as if you are reaching into the past, but where is that memory actually appearing? It is here, in the present moment. The past is not being revisited directly, it is being reconstructed as an experience now, in the same way. Imagine something that has not yet happened, a conversation you might have, a place you might go. The future seems to stretch out ahead, but the image of it, the sense of possibility, is also appearing here, in this moment. So both the past and the future are not separate places we travel to. They are experiences that arise within the present. And this leads to a subtle but important shift in how we think about time. Instead of imagining time as a long line, with the past behind us and the future ahead, we begin to see it as something that is constantly being formed in the present, a process rather than a path. To make this more intuitive, imagine watching a flowing stream. The water moves, but what you see at any moment is always the water that is here now. The previous water has already passed, the water ahead has not yet arrived, but the flow itself is continuous. Time may be something like that, a continuous unfolding where each moment gathers what has been and opens into what could be, all within a single present experience. And within this gathering, something else quietly takes place. Choice, because as memories appear and possibilities unfold, there is often a moment where one direction becomes real. You decide to speak or remain silent, to move or to stay still, and that decision, like everything else, happens in the present. It is not made in the past, it is not made in the future, it arises here, at the meeting point of memory and possibility. This makes the present moment something quite special. It is not just a point in time, it is the place where everything comes together, the place where the stable patterns of the body and the fluid possibilities of the mind meet within awareness, the place where experience unfolds, moment by moment. And if we stay with this idea, we begin to notice something even more subtle. The present moment is not fixed. It is not a frozen instant. It is alive. It has depth. Within a single moment, there can be layers of experience, a sound, a thought, a feeling, all appearing together, interwoven. And within that same moment, there can be traces of the past and hints of the future, all coexisting. This richness suggests that the present is not a thin slice between what has been and what will be. It is a dynamic field where multiple aspects of experience are continuously interacting. And this has an important implication, because if everything we experience, past, future, and present, appears within this unfolding field, then time, as we know it, may not be something that exists independently. It may be something that emerges from the way experience is structured, from the way memory is held, from the way possibilities are explored, from the way moments give rise to one another. In this sense, time is not something we move through, but something that is continuously created as experience unfolds. And this idea connects gently with everything we have explored so far, that reality may not be made of fixed objects, but of patterns, possibilities, and the process by which one possibility becomes real. The present moment is where that process happens. It is where patterns are experienced, where possibilities are explored, and where one path is quietly chosen. And all of this occurs within awareness, not outside of it, but within it, as part of the same unfolding. And as this idea begins to settle, it brings a quiet sense of clarity, because instead of searching for reality somewhere else, in distant places or distant times, we begin to recognize that everything we're looking for is already present, here, in this moment, not as a final answer, but as an ongoing process, a continuous unfolding in which memory, possibility, and choice are always meeting and becoming something new. The present moment begins to feel different, not just a point in time, but a place where everything gathers, as the place where memory, imagination, and experience all gather together. Our attention is drawn toward one final movement within this unfolding, a movement so subtle that it often goes unnoticed, the moment when something that could happen becomes something that does. Because throughout everything we have explored so far, there has been a quiet theme in the background: possibility. The mind explores possibilities. The future appears as possibilities. Even at the deepest levels of nature, there seem to be many ways things could unfold. And yet, in each moment, only one path is realized. Only one experience becomes present. This transition from what could be to what is one of the most delicate aspects of reality. It does not arrive with noise or force. It happens quietly, like a single note emerging from silence. To sense this more clearly, imagine standing before a simple decision. Perhaps something small, like choosing what to say next, or whether to move or remain still. Before the choice is made, there are several possibilities. You could speak, you could remain quiet. Both feel available, both feel real in their own way. And then, without a clear boundary, one of those possibilities becomes actual. Words are spoken, or silence remains. The moment settles into a single outcome, and the other possibilities fade softly into the background, not erased, but no longer active. This quiet transition is something we experience constantly, not only in large decisions, but in the smallest movements of life. Each step, each thought, each action is a movement from possibility into reality. And this movement does not feel entirely mechanical. It does not feel like a rigid sequence of events, where everything is already determined in advance. Instead, it carries a subtle openness, a sense that things could have unfolded differently, even if only slightly. And this sense of openness has led some thinkers to wonder whether the unfolding of reality involves more than randomness and more than strict determination, whether, at a very deep level, there is something like participation, not necessarily a conscious decision in the way we usually think of it, but a gentle selection among possibilities. It is important to approach this idea carefully, because science in its current form does not claim that the universe makes choices in the way a person does. It describes patterns, probabilities, ways in which events tend to unfold, and these descriptions are precise, powerful, deeply reliable. But they do not fully answer one quiet question: why this outcome instead of another? Why does one possibility become real, while others remain unrealized? Some interpretations suggest that this transition is fundamentally random, that there is no deeper reason, only a distribution of likelihoods, and this may indeed be part of the story. But from the perspective we have been exploring, there is space for another way of looking, not as replacement, but as an addition, a gentle expansion of the picture. Because if reality is not only structure, but also experience, if awareness is not separate from the unfolding of the world, then perhaps this transition from possibility to reality is not entirely blind. Perhaps it is not only random, but also participatory, a process in which reality, in some subtle way, takes part in its own unfolding. You might think of it like a melody once more. A melody can be written, its structure defined, but when it is played, there is still a sense of interpretation, a slight variation in timing, a softness or intensity in each note. The structure guides the music, but the expression brings it to life. In a similar way, the patterns of reality may provide the structure, but the unfolding of each moment may carry something more, a quality that cannot be reduced entirely to rules or probabilities, and this is where the idea of choice can be introduced, very gently, not as a force that overrides the laws of nature, but as a way of describing this subtle transition, the moment when one possibility becomes real, the moment when the open landscape of what could be narrows into what is, and whether we call this choice or simply unfolding, the experience of it remains the same. Reality is not static, it is continuously becoming, moment by moment, and each moment carries within it a quiet sense of arrival, something coming into presence, something taking shape. And as we sit with this, we begin to sense that this process is not happening somewhere else. It is happening here. In every experience, in every moment of awareness, the world is not simply existing. It is unfolding. And we are not outside of that unfolding. We are part of it, not as separate observers, but as participants within the same continuous process. And this realization brings us gently to the edge of our final step. Because if reality is continuously becoming, if each moment is a transition from possibility into experience, then perhaps the universe is not just a system that exists, but something that is gradually, quietly, coming to know itself. Reality begins to feel less static and more like something quietly unfolding moment by moment, not as something to grasp tightly, but as something to gently feel. We arrive at a place that feels less like an ending and more like a quiet widening of perspective, because throughout this journey, we have not been building toward a single answer. We have been slowly turning, looking at the same mystery from different angles, allowing it to reveal itself, one layer at a time. We began with something simple, awareness, the undeniable sense that experience is always present, always here, even before we understand what it is. From there, we notice something subtle, that science, for all its clarity and precision, can describe the structures of the world, but does not fully capture what it feels like to experience them. And this gentle gap didn't close as we looked deeper. It widened, because as we explored the nature of reality itself, we began to see that what appears solid may not be as fixed as it seems. That space may emerge from deeper relationships, that what we call things may be patterns, that beneath the surface of certainty, there is a quiet openness, a landscape of possibilities, and from there, the story began to turn. Instead of building reality from parts, we considered the possibility that the whole comes first, that everything we experience is not separate pieces coming together, but expressions of a deeper unity, a whole that appears in many forms. And as we stayed with that idea, we allowed another possibility to emerge, that this whole is not only structured, but also aware, in a way that may not be obvious, but may be fundamental, not awareness like a human mind, but a more subtle capacity, a capacity for knowing, and from there something even more delicate appeared, that knowing and existing may not be separate, that to know something is to bring it into presence, to allow it to become part of experience. And this led us to see reality in a new way, not just as a collection of objects, but as something more like a language, patterns that carry structure, and through awareness become meaningful, not static, but expressive. And within that expression, we notice something essential. That experience cannot be copied. That meaning does not exist in symbols alone, but arises in the act of experiencing. And so, awareness became not just an observer, but a participant, part of the process through which reality becomes something that can be felt, something that can be known. From there, we turned inward again, toward our own experience, and we saw that what we call the body may be a stable pattern, a kind of memory held in form, while the mind is a space of possibility where different futures can be explored, and both of these are held within the present moment, the place where everything gathers, where memory, imagination, and choice meet, and where each moment becomes real. And finally, we arrived at the quiet transition from possibility to reality, the moment where something that could be becomes something that is, not with force, but with a kind of gentle settling. And now, as we step back and look at the whole picture, something begins to come into focus, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling, a sense of coherence, a sense that all of these pieces are part of the same unfolding story. Because if reality is made of patterns, and if those patterns carry possibility, and if awareness is what allows those patterns to become meaningful, then the universe is not just existing, it is expressing, it is unfolding, it is, in some quiet way, knowing, not necessarily in words, not in thoughts, but in the most direct sense, through experience itself. Each moment, each perception, each shift from possibility into reality is part of that process. And if we allow this idea to rest, gently, it begins to suggest something very simple, that what we call spacetime, the vast structure in which everything appears, may not be just a stage, it may be more like a record, a kind of memory. Not memory as we usually think of it, but memory as continuity, as the persistence of patterns, as the unfolding trace of everything that has been carried forward into what is. In this sense, the universe does not just move through time, it carries time within it, each moment leaving a subtle imprint, each experience becoming part of the whole. And so, reality may not be something static, but something that is slowly remembering itself. Not remembering in the way we recall events, but remembering as an ongoing process, a continuous deepening of what is known. And within this process, each perspective, each experience plays a role, not separate from the whole, but as an expression of it. And this includes you, not as an observer standing outside the universe, but as part of the same unfolding, the same quiet process of knowing. And as we rest here, there is no need to resolve anything, no need to decide what is ultimately true. It is enough to notice that experience is present, that reality is unfolding, and that within this unfolding there is a sense of continuity, a sense of connection, a sense that everything, in some subtle way, belongs together. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, You're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.